Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm a scientist emeritus with the Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. I'd like to recognize my co-authors, Barbara Bentz of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Lisa Holsinger, and Vicky Saab, all of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Rachel Lohman of the USGS. What we want to present today is a simulation experiment where we looked at modeled interactions of mountain pine beetles and wildland fire under future climate and management scenarios for 3 western landscapes. I am going to present the part of the study where we actually evaluated the importance of including disturbances into the model. And of course, we used the disturbance of mountain pine beetle to illustrate how important mountain pine beetle is to simulate in the future. Okay, so most modelers, when they start or build a model, they develop a flow chart, which is more or less depicted in this particular slide, of the elements they want to include in the model. They want to include climate, and of course they want to include weather, which is the time step in which climate should be actually modeled. But then they also, most landscape modelers want to include vegetation, some sort of vegetation, and the variables that they use to describe the vegetation can be dictated by what other elements they actually want to include the model. And from this case, in this particular model linkages diagram, we can see that fuels are also a part of it, the type, the amount, continuity, and so on. So that means that with vegetation, you have to model individual trees, and you have to model individual tree species and so on to get the fuels correct. So on and on it goes. And this is how most models are developed in the world. And it is a pretty common phenomena that these model linkages also reflect the knowledge of the particular modeler that's building the model. However, what keeps me up at night and what gives me nightmares is that did I forget to add particular variables or disturbances or vegetation responses in the model that I should have in order for the model to actually predict what will happen to the landscape in the future. In other words, in a greater sense, most modelers should think about the question about what are the appropriate climate, vegetation, disturbance, and topographical variables to include in landscape models. This is incredibly important because the slate of variables that you choose to represent in your model will dictate the interactions that you'll be able to model. And most climate modelers recognize that it is the interactions between these variables that will drive future landscape conditions. It is not the actual variable itself. So interactions are important, and whatever variables you include must be able to be handled by interactions. In this talk, I'm not really going to talk about the model as a whole, but I'm going to narrow my discussion down to exactly what kind of disturbances are we forgetting? What are the key disturbance agents that will be important in the future? And this is also important in that if a particular disturbance such as mistletoe isn't important now, will it be important in the future under future climates? So these are incredibly important things that most modelers have to think about. And then the second thing is, how should these disturbances be simulated? Most people know that empirical models have a very small range of conditions of which they can be applied because the range is dictated by the data that we use to create the empirical models. So should empirical models be used to model future climates where there are no data and there are no data cloud that we can use to develop or revise these empirical models? All important questions that need to be done, and all things that give me nightmares at night when I stop and think of the models I built in the past and what exactly did I forget. Okay, so how can we determine what the importance of a single disturbance is and whether or not we should include it in the simulation? Well, what we did is that we took an existing landscape model, a model that I've been working on for over 30 years called FireBGC, and we created a simulation experiment to assess the importance of mountain pine beetle, or MPB, to current and future landscape projections. In other words, is mountain pine beetle important to understand and also to accurately predict what landscapes will look like in the future? The Fire BGC model, the second version, is really a kitchen sink model. And we strove to make everything in Fire BGC mechanistic, which means that it runs on first principles. There are 5 scales that are identified in Fire BGC: the tree, the species, the stand, and the site. And you can see by the table in the bottom right that at each scale, there's a description of what each of the scales mean, and then some of the processes, not all of them, but some of them that are actually simulated at the scale. The take-home message here is that Fire BGC is a highly mechanistic model, and it is a landscape model that predicts landscape composition and structure in various ways into the future under climate change. We parameterized and calibrated 3 landscapes for Fire BGC in this particular simulation experiment. All 3 of these landscapes were chosen because they actually were pine dominated. The Ochoco landscape of the Roosevelt National Forest in Oregon was one that is dominated by ponderosa pine and has a frequent fire regime. The Elkhorns, we found out, does not have, only has about 8% of what we would call pine domination. Most of the Elkhorns are ponderosa, are Douglas fir, and very little is ponderosa pine. But we added the Elkhorns into this experiment. And the last one, of course, is the lodgepole pine forests of the Yellowstone Central Plateau and the Yellowstone National Park. This is a very large landscape, and it is almost exclusively lodgepole pine, dominated with some whitebark pine and subalpine fir. These 3 landscapes were integrated as part of the study. This is the factorial simulation design for our simulation experiment. They were 4 treatments, and each treatment had a various number of factors. The first treatment was the mountain pine beetle, and we're going to talk about this more later, but we simulated no mountain pine beetles. Simulated mountain pine beetles was a simple model and a complex model. We also had 2 climates, historical and future. And the future was an RCP 8.5 hot dry scenario where we were plus 6 degrees C higher in temperature and about 7 to 10% lower in precipitation. We simulated 2 fire management regimes where there were no fire suppression at all, which of course more or less simulates historical ranges of variation. And then we did a full suppression where 96% of the fires were suppressed. 4% of the fires were allowed to burn because we assumed that these 4% could not be suppressed because of either climate, fire behavior, or the allocation of resources that weren't available. There was a fuel treatment part of this. We simulated 3 fuel treatments, but we are not going to discuss that in our talk. So the model was run for 400 years, and output was simulated, output to an ASCII file every 10 years. And we did 5 replicates of this, and this gave us 200 observations of 7 variables. These 7 variables are listed here. You can read them off. These 7 variables were used in our analyses. Okay, let's talk about that mountain pine beetle factor and all the treatments and all the factors that are in there. Of course, there were no mountain pine beetle simulation, and this was to see if we compared a no mountain pine beetle simulation with a simulated mountain pine beetle module, and just to see if there was a big difference in landscape composition and structure. Then we had the simple mountain pine beetle simulation where the original Fire BGC had the Ammon and Cole 1983 model that was implemented in prognosis, which is now called FVS. And then I gathered a bunch of spatial relationships from the literature to simulate the initiation, outbreak, and the cessation of a mountain pine beetle outbreak on the landscape. Then we used the Powell and Bentz 2014 mountain pine beetle simulation model, and this model is very mechanistic, simulates actual mountain pine beetle populations based on temperature, landscape composition, and structure, and these things drive mountain pine beetle population dynamics. It's a highly complicated model. It takes a lot of computer resources to run, but we felt that this was just about the most complicated mechanistic model that we could implement in Fire BGC. So let's look at some of the results of the simulation model. number one I'd like to show you is down here is, don't forget, these box and whisker plots are of 200 observations. So there are 200 observations that were used to quantify the variation in this particular place, the basal area of mountain pine beetle host species, which are pines that are greater than 8 centimeters in diameter. First thing I'd like you to see is that the red box and whisker plots are with no mountain pine beetle simulation. The blue is with a simple or empirical model of mountain pine beetle dynamics. And then, of course, the green is the complex model, the Powell and Bentz model of 2014. So these colors, red, blue, and green, dictate the 3 factors in the mountain pine beetle treatment. On the y-axis, of course, is the basal area in meters squared per hectare. And then we see the 3 landscapes down here, Ochiko, Elkhorns, and Yellowstone Central Plateau, under historical climate and future climate, with and without suppression. So let's take a look. If we look at the first one, we can see that the box and whisker plot, and by the way, the box and whisker, the box is the 30th and 70th percentile, the whiskers are the 90th and 10th percentile, and the black horizontal line is the mean. So we see that if there are no mountain pine beetle simulation, we get a completely different result for the Ochiko landscape if we implemented the empirical one or the complex one. And this particular theme is found all the way through this particular set of simulation experiment, this set of runs for the simulation experiment. You can see that that if you do not put mountain pine beetles in there, all the answers, whether it's fire suppression or no suppression, in the future and past, you get a completely different answer. Next, you will also notice that the blue or the simple model results almost always differ from the green or the complex model results. And the complex model results, which we feel are a lot more accurate, are always differ from the other two. There are cases like under suppression where there's no difference between the mountain pine beetle simulation and the empirical model, but you'll notice that indeed the mechanistic model does pick up mountain pine beetle reactions much better under suppression and so on. So basic theme, and for this particular variable, the basal area, you can see that indeed mountain pine beetle their outbreaks do create entirely different landscapes, both in the past, with past climate, but more importantly, they create different landscapes in the future. And you can see that without mountain pine beetle, you get almost double or triple the basal area that you would get if you included mountain pine beetle in the simulation. And then secondly, look at the difference between the complex model and the simple model, and note that it really does make a difference between the complexity of the model, because the more complex the model, the more interactions you're able to actually model. Now let's take a look at the second variable, which is the proportion of landscape that is in the mountain pine beetle host species. Unfortunately, these are not grown trees. These also include pine-dominated stands that may be seedling or sapling. So I could not differentiate between the two. All we know here is that the proportional landscape in the mountain pine beetle host species is dominated by pine. And here you can see pretty much the same thing happening. Without mountain pine beetle simulations, you really are not getting the dynamics that you need when you include mountain pine beetle. And you can see that the mechanistic is much different than the simple. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the blue box and whisker plots in the future climate. And the reason these are so variable is because I don't believe that the simple model could handle, or it did not behave in a really good fashion under future conditions. It was unable to anticipate mountain pine beetle impacts very well, and thereby that is why we have a high, almost excessively high variation in landscape composition in the future. This to me indicates that the simple model just does not perform well in the future. Interestingly, if we looked at the annual percent of landscape burned, which is, wildfire, we can see that the mountain pine beetle simulations really didn't matter. And it turned out that mountain pine beetle really doesn't change how much of the landscape is burned each year. That is really driven by climate. What the mountain pine beetle simulations do is change the fuel on the ground because of pine death. And this, of course, changes fire intensity and also fire severity. So, but as far as the annual percent of landscape burn, mountain pine beetle simulations did not really impact that at all. So, what did we learn from this comprehensive simulation experiment? Well, the first thing we learned is the importance of mountain pine beetle to simulating landscape dynamics. Without mountain pine beetle, we would have definitely got the wrong projections, or these projections that we had were probably going to be in error because we didn't include mountain pine beetle in its interactions across all the other landscape components in its importance of predicting landscape conditions in the future. The other thing we found out is complex mechanistic mountain pine beetle models capture a lot more of the interactions than the empirical model. In fact, our complex Barbara Bentz model was a lot better than the empirical model in that the empirical model seemed to break down under future climates. So complex mechanistic models are always better because they include more of the interactions and they link to more of the interactions across the mechanistic landscape model. Next thing is that we found there were very little effects of the area burned and wildland fire. And wildland fire mountain pine beetle interactions were more subtle than we thought. Mainly they occurred at the stand level and mainly through the changes in fuel conditions. So what mountain pine beetle did is it changed fire intensity and severity and really not fire growth and so on. Next, fire suppression we found generally increased the number and size of the host species of mountain pine beetle on the landscape, and this of course meant a wider variation in landscape dynamics as these large areas burned when 4% of those fires that couldn't be controlled were actually burned the landscape. So fire suppression generally increases the basal area of host species and so on. And lastly, I think that mechanistic simulations captured a greater variation than the empirical simulations. And this is, of course, because when you include more interactions in the model, you tend to get more variable results. And more variable results, to me, indicate more realism. There is a time when the variability, like we saw in some of the empirical models, the variability was so great that you could see that indeed the empirical mountain pine beetle model was failing. So what is the take-home message here? Well, modelers better figure out what disturbances are important in order to predict landscape dynamics in the future accurately and precisely. Thanks, everyone, and I'll take questions now. So modelers should learn to do a comprehensive assessment of all the variables, disturbance variables, that they should include in their model. And then this, of course, depends on the landscape, whether or not it's pine dominated or whatever, the successional trajectories, does pine enter in any of the early successional stages and so on, the responses to climate, is it a high elevation landscape, a low elevation landscape, and so on. And then, of course, what about the other disturbances that lack a mechanistic model? Spruce budworm, root rot, mistletoe grazing, and everything else. If we don't have a mechanistic model, is it okay to use an empirical model? Or should we do additional testing on the empirical model to see if it does indeed fall apart like ours did in the future under future climates? I want to thank everyone, and I guess we can ask for questions.